Can I welcome everyone to this, the 31st meeting of the Justice Committee in 2012. Can I ask everyone to switch off mobile phones and other electronic devices completely as they interfere with the broadcasting system, even when switched to silent? No, David McCletchie sends his apologies. Item 1, decision on taking business in private. The committee is invited to agree whether to consider items 6, 7 and 8 in private. Is committee agreed?
No.
Which one are you? Is all of them or one in particular?
Convener, I see no good reason why items 7 and 8, that's the work programme and the statute law repeals bill, should be taken in private.
Yeah, well, what I'd like to do is to, can I leave that decision and move on to item 2 then, so we can deal with the Minister and then deal with these items later?
To decide if they're taken
in
public
yes,
or private,
just,
yes.
I'm parking, is that all right? Just that part of the agenda, and we'll come on to that later. I'd like to move on to item 2 in the agenda, one affirmative instrument, the Draft Fire Scotland Act 2005 Relevant Premises Regulations 2012. This is an opportunity to take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary on the instrument before formally debating the motion to approve the SSI under the next agenda item. The Sub-Ledge Committee has not drawn the Parliament's attention to the instrument on any grounds within its remit, and I welcome Kenny McCaskill, Cabinet Secretary for Justice, and Richard Dennis, Head of Fire and Rescue Services Division at Scottish Government. And before, Cabinet Secretary, you start, I want to remind you that in 1999, you advised me to set up the cross-party group for Borders Rail. You maybe don't remember it, but I do. And today, the document was signed, transferring it over from Transport Scotland to Network Rail. So there you go. Credit to you for that. I may disagree with you on lots of other things en route, but that was a great piece of advice. And I must tell you about this. I'm so thrilled, and I wanted to thank you for that. Anyway, back to business. Can I just say that we move straight to questions, as the Cabinet Secretary has nothing to state about this. And have you got questions, committee? Alison.
Just a brief question on whether or not you think these are proportionate for very small situations, and individual childminders and things. Whether you think that that's covered.
I think these are individual matters. Clearly, they are small, but I think given the nature of the vulnerable people we're dealing with, I think obviously we have to do everything we can and draw to attention those who are in a privileged and responsible position of their obligations. So I think that's where it's coming from. So you're right, that's why it's been dealt with at subordinate legislation, to focus in on an area where we know that there's a growing market, where it's appropriate that people should take the steps that are necessary.
You believe it's proportional?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? No other questions. I now move to the next item, which is the formal debate. The affirmative instrument considered under the previous item. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to formally move the motion? I take it no members wish to speak. Right. I put the question. The question is that motion S4M 4635 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Thank you very much. As usual, we are required to report to Parliament on this affirmative instrument. Can I ask members if they are content to delegate to me authority for the final wording of this report?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Now, can I just, for a minute, suspend so that the next set of officials can come in for the next item of business, but we stay put. This is the final evidence session on the draft budget, and can I ask members, and they don't have to, but in the main, to focus questions on police reform and courts budget, which we decided would be our target to start with, and any other issues, of course, that you wish to raise. We'll then cover the budget for implementing the Commission on Women Offenders findings during the following item. So you don't need to get into that just now, Alison. I can see you're ready to go. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and Richard Dennis, Head of Fire and Rescue Services Division at the Scottish Government, for staying with us for this item, and welcome other Scottish Government officials: Colin Mackay, Deputy Director, Legal System Division; Deborah Smith, Head of Police Division; and Joe Griffin, Deputy Director, Community Justice. And can I ask you, Cabinet Secretary, I think you want to make a short opening statement, and then members' questions, please.
Thank you, Convener. I'm grateful for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. When I was here last year to discuss our draft budget, I made the point that our record of investment across the justice portfolio was delivering real benefits for our communities. That remains the case, and it's worthwhile reminding the committee of what's been achieved. We've put 1,000 more police in Scotland's streets and are driving the reform of our police and fire services to maintain them in the face of the UK Government's budget reductions. Recorded crime is now at its lowest level in 37 years, and there were over 100,000 fewer crimes recorded by the police in 2011-12 than before we came to office. Critically, reconviction rates are now at their lowest level in Scotland in the past 13 years. The clear-up rate for all recorded crimes is at its highest level for over 30 years. Violent crime is down by just under a third, and offences involving a firearm are down by almost half since the SNP came into government. Crimes of handling an offensive weapon are down by 44% since we took office, and custodial sentence lengths are up for the 6th consecutive year. Almost 3/4 of summary court cases were dealt with within 26 weeks in 2011-12, compared to only 2/3 when we came to office. And we've ploughed the proceeds of crime back into communities, using over 46 million seized from criminals to invest in community projects benefiting over 600,000 young people. Only this morning, statistics have been released which show falling levels of homicides. In 2011-12, there were 88 homicide cases recorded by the police in Scotland, a decrease of 11% from the 99 cases recorded in 2010-11. I could say more about our record on tackling serious and organised crime, our investment in the prison and court estate, our commitment to reducing reoffending, and our determination to support recovery from drug addiction. But these matters may arise in the course of our discussion today. Our draft budget for 2013-14 is focused on maintaining services in the face of Westminster cuts, while supporting activity to modernise our justice system. Our track record is one of driving ever greater efficiency and improvement, and that work will continue. In terms of the technical budget adjustments related to funding for the police and fire services, I would refer to my letter of 30th October, which I hope was helpful to the committee. And I realise that the committee wished to focus today's discussion on police reform, women offenders and courts budgets, so I won't go into those issues in depth at this point. I will simply say that the priorities in our draft budget are to further reduce crime, particularly violent and serious organised crime, to reduce the harmful impact of drug abuse, to prevent criminal behaviour by young people, to build on our strong record of reducing reoffending, to reduce the fear of crime in local communities, to reduce the harm from fires and other emergencies, to continue to tackle hate crime and sectarianism, to transform civil and administrative justice while widening access and taking forward law reform, and of course to continue to support victims and witnesses within the criminal justice system. I hope I've made clear the significant achievements of recent years, and I'll finish by saying that I believe that in these difficult economic times, this government is continuing to plan its spending wisely to keep Scotland's people safe, and I and my officials would be happy to take any questions which you or the committee may have.
Much, Cabinet Secretary. And I want to say to members, I'd like, just for the sake of doing the report that we have to draft, to focus first of all on police reform, and it's the budget, remember, and then on to courts, then on to other issues, and remind members that we do the Court and Vale in the second session, right? So that just helps with writing our report, so it's got some kind of coherence. Jenny, anybody else questions? Followed by Alison, followed by Graham, followed by Rod.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. The First Minister denies that police officers are doing civilian staff duties, but recent reports in the Sunday Herald revealed that a group who report to you, made up of Chief Constables and Scottish Government officials, put forward proposals that cuts to police staff would have to be delivered by police officers performing basic administrative duties themselves. Cabinet Secretary, is the First Minister wrong to have denied the existence of backfilling?
Well, I think the best evidence was the evidence you had from the newly appointed Chief Constable for the Police Service of Scotland. He came here, you doubtless heard his evidence. He made it quite clear that there was no strategy for that. He wasn't aware of evidence of that. He's the person best in position to confirm that, and I accept the evidence from the Chief Constable.
But There was a paper, Cabinet Secretary, that was prepared by your own officials suggesting that this should happen and this was an obvious place to go.
Well, I've always been told you accept the best evidence rule in law. That might not be a matter known to you, Miss Mara, but it's a matter known to me and doubtless to other members. I think the best evidence is the evidence of the Chief Constable who has been appointed. He sat here. I don't know whether it was a question for you or one of your colleagues, but he made it quite clear that he wasn't aware of that. It wasn't a strategy being pursued. It wasn't a strategy he would support. And as I say, that doesn't underestimate the challenges that he and his colleagues face. But as I say, that is the best evidence, and I accept the evidence of Chief Constable House.
Okay, so you can guarantee us today that there's no backfilling going on across Scotland?
Well, I accept the evidence of what Chief Constable House, which said he wasn't aware of that and there was no strategy to pursue it, and it would be a wrong course to pursue.
Okay, thank you. Can you guarantee that that backfilling won't happen in the future?
Well, I've been at this committee many times as we were bringing forward the Police and Fire Reform Bill. At that, I took many questions, sometimes from yourself, in particular from other members, that I must not direct or interfere with the police. On that basis, we have enshrined in an Act of Parliament that the Chief Constable is accountable to the police authority. I am entirely separate from that. That is constitutionally correct. So, as I say, I have to leave these matters to them. But I do accept the word of Stephen House, who I congratulate on his appointment, who has made his position quite clear. And I have no evidence from anybody else to believe that that is not the situation.
Despite the recommendations in the paper put to you by your own officials?
Well, I go on the evidence of the Chief Constable, and that was the evidence that you took. It was questions from you, and I accept the statement that he made.
Okay, thank you. Can I move to something else, Convener?
Is it still on policing?
Yes, it is,
yes.
Absolutely. Now, the same group, Cabinet Secretary, who report to you suggest in this paper a 20% reduction in the overall estate footprint for the Scottish Police. Can you give us an assurance today that this will not result in any local police stations closing in Scotland?
Well, again, I think that matter was touched upon by Chief Constable House when he gave evidence. First of all, I once again have to reiterate that at the request of the committee, a matter supported by the government, these are decisions for the Chief Constable and for the police authority. That's a constitutional position that we've enshrined, and that's how it will be. I will adhere to that. But I do think that Chief Constable House made it quite clear that any reference to the police estate relates to the fact that we will not need 8 HR departments, 8 payroll departments, and so on and so forth. It was not a reference to police stations.
With respect, Cabinet Secretary, all of these decisions are not at the discretion of Chief Constable House, because the Scottish Government yourself has given him a figure of 17,234 police officers that he must stick with. So these are not all operational decisions for Chief Constable House. And with respect, I'm asking you today, can you guarantee that there will be no local police station closures in Scotland?
Well, no Justice Secretary can ever make any guarantee of that because it's not their decision to make. The decision on the closure of a police station currently, as constituted, is by the Chief Constable in the 8 authorities that we have, subject to the board, unitary or otherwise. In the new service post 1st April, it is a decision of the Chief Constable that will be subject to the scrutiny and approval of the Scottish Police Authority. The paper you refer to is not from my officials, it's a paper from ACPOS, that's the Association of Chief Police Officers. That is an organisation that to some extent is now superseded and trumped post 1st April by the Chief Constable of Scotland, who is Mr House. So I stand behind the evidence given by him. It would be entirely wrong of me to give a commitment because it would indicate that I would be interfering in operational matters that must remain within the remit and running of the Chief Constable, subject to the scrutiny and accountability to the police authority.
That would be interfering in operational matters, but the arbitrary figure of 17,234 is not interfering.
I don't think that is. I think we've taken view as a government that a visible police presence is what is delivering a 37-year low in crime, and even today an 11% reduction in homicides. A visible police presence, we think as a government, and I know it's a matter disputed by other political parties, but that's a matter of political choice. It's why we have an election, whether in the United States or in Scotland. We think a visible police presence reassures the people of Scotland. That's not a position adopted south of the border, where we do face something of the loss of 16,000 to 18,000 officers under the coalition government. The Labour Party in opposition thinks that 10,000 is the number of officers that should be lost. We actually think in Scotland maintaining that police presence is a good thing to do. If the Chief Constable and the authority were to come to me at any stage and raise other matters, these are matters I'm happy to discuss with them. But at the present moment, Chief Constable House also agrees that a visible police presence is what helps to make our community safe. And the proof is in the pudding, as they say. I did read out the fine track record that our police service, whether support staff or uniformed staff or indeed detective officers, have delivered, and I pay credit to them.
Convener, can I move to one last question on the budgetary implications of terms and conditions for serving police officers?
Well,
one last question.
Okay, because I think we've got a big list of people. So last one on this, then I'll take, just to let people know where they are. I've got Alison, then Graham, then Rod, then Sandra. Okay? Right, Jenny.
Cabinet Secretary, on the evidence of Chief Constable House, he was here at committee a couple of weeks ago and I asked him about terms and conditions for police officers and police staff. Because the weekend before you had told SNP Conference in Perth that for those who serve there will be no attack upon the terms and conditions under which they serve. And I understand that you have been nominated for a debating award for that very speech. But Stephen House told this committee 2 weeks ago that terms and conditions would be a fairly obvious place to go in many respects, and I quote him. Which of you is right?
I just want to say I've got another nominee beside me, one to watch. I'm watching this little duo
Absolutely.
go on. The rest of us, I think, haven't been nominated, though we're all brilliant. You're all very, very good. Yes.
Well, terms and conditions in any employment between employers and employees. The employee of the Scottish Police Force is the Chief Constable, who is accountable to the Scottish Police Authority. That is a matter that the representatives, whether SPF or ASPS, or indeed even currently ACPOS or what may be the successor or SCPOSA, would enter into. So they're the matters that deal with that. But as an administration, we have made it quite clear. We reject and will not implement the proposals brought in south of the border by Tom Windsor. That is a matter being picked up and delivered by the coalition government. We reject that. That will not be done. I don't know what the position in of Windsor of the Labour Party south of the border or north of the border, but we will not implement the Windsor proposals. Beyond that, the relationship between employer and employee is a matter that the Chief Constable will deal with the Scottish Police Federation. I meet both individually. If need be, I'm happy at some instances to meet them collectively, but as a matter constitutionally and correctly dealt with between them. But I would ask you to perhaps confirm that the position of the Labour Party is that Windsor is wrong.
Well, actually, you're here being asked, Cabinet Secretary, not the Labour Party.
Thank you, Convener. But Cabinet Secretary, you've told us this morning that you accept the very good evidence from Chief Constable House on the past two issues I've asked you about. So will you accept his evidence that he gave to this committee that terms and conditions are a fairly obvious place to go in many respects when looking to save money? Will you accept that that was his evidence to the committee?
Well, I meet with Chief Constable House. I also meet with the Federation. I was on the phone to the General Secretary yesterday regarding the tragedy in Baird Street, and I put on record my sympathies and condolences to the family and indeed to the colleagues there. So I meet with them regularly. This is a matter that I have to leave to them. There are various matters, as Mr Pearson will know from his experience. Some of them are clearly critical in terms of pay and indeed pensions. And I meet regularly with the Scottish Police Federation because of the attack and cash grab by the UK government upon their pensions, in which I am really only able to sympathise and write letters of objections. I disagree with the unilateral way in which the Home Secretary has disbanded the PNB, but we are setting up a separate authority here in Scotland to shadow that, in which we seek to have not myself sitting there, but we have officials representing the employers and we have officials representing the employees. That is how matters are dealt with. They are not dealt with by the diktat of the Justice Secretary. They're dealt with by the relationship between the employers and the employees. And as we dictate and discuss terms and conditions, some matters are currently precluded to Scotland because matters are dealt with on a pan-UK basis. Other matters, as I say, in terms of Tom Windsor, we have made it quite clear where our position stands. But there are matters that will constantly be ongoing. between the Federation, the Association of Scottish Police Superintendents, and indeed SCUPOSA or whatever organisation supersedes them, together with the authority and the chief.
So terms and conditions are an operational matter and you cannot guarantee that they will not be undermined to save money in your budget?
Well, I can give you an absolute assurance. We're not implementing Windsor, not now, not ever. I made that clear to the Police Federation conference and they appreciated that. There are matters that ebb and flow over terms and conditions because we have had the situation relating to police officers' houses, we've had police officers' boot allowances, a whole variety of matters. And indeed, some of the greater complexities that we have currently in moving the police and fire bill forward are things such as police benevolent trusts. So the devil is always in the detail. But I leave that to the good offices of those who represent the employees, those who serve, whether in the Federation or indeed in support staff through Unison or Unite, and indeed those who represent the employers, who in this instance will be the Chief Constable, his support staff and the Scottish Police Authority.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, Alison, then Graham, please.
Thank you. Morning, Cabinet
Morning.
Secretary. We know that current police authorities are making quite significant savings this year in order to ease some of the budget pressures in the forthcoming year. We heard from Chief Constable Smith when he was giving evidence to the committee. We heard a plea from him that the additional reserves that are beginning to be built up because of those savings probably amount to about £14 million. That's in addition to the £36 million reserves that you've already negotiated with COSLA about how that will be shared out. We heard from Chief Constable Smith that he would urge you to consider giving that money back to the new authority. Is that something that you've been able to think about?
Well, we agreed with COSLA that all uncommitted reserves will be split by the Scottish Government and local authorities on a 51%, 49% ratio. A different ratio was dealt with for fire. It's for the Scottish Government to determine how to allocate its share in line with priorities across all portfolios, including justice. These are matters that we require to tackle when the police require additional funds, such as in my first year in office when we faced the challenges of the airport terrorist matter. Additional funds were provided, and equally, as I say, when other matters are required elsewhere, we deal with that way. So it's a matter for us to determine across all portfolios and across the justice portfolio where the requirement is.
So you don't anticipate that the additional 14 million would be allocated in a different way? You're saying that you will continue to allocate that on the 49-51 split?
What we're saying is it doesn't require to be put away in a savings fund by any one authority, because I will be taking questions from you on other aspects of justice portfolio where there are challenges. And I think you would probably not wish me to be saying that we don't have the money for that because it's currently gathering, 0.5% interest or whatever squirreled away somewhere. So this is about making sure that across the justice portfolio, across the government portfolio, given the tight budgets that we face, and they are tight budgets, there are challenges for Kevin Smith and his current portfolio, there are challenges for Chief Constable House, there are challenges for the Lord President, there are challenges across everyone in government and indeed local government. It's to make sure that we use the money that is limited as wisely as possible, and that's why we will put it where the priorities are. And on that, we're happy to discuss with the committee.
Thank you very much. Graham, followed by Rod, please.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. If I can, I'd like to cover three areas.
Yeah.
At the last Justice Committee, Kevin Smith indicated that a paper had been prepared which would identify the areas of savings for years 1, 2 and 3 in the new arrangement for the single police force. And we had been promised that paper, but as I understand, we haven't received it. Have you received details of how the savings will be achieved, and can you share some indication of where these savings will come from? Because they are significant savings.
Well, these are fundamentally matters for the police authority and for the chief, but Deborah, do you want to?
I was just going to say the same thing, Cabinet Secretary, and we've not seen detailed proposals. That's now, Chief Constable Smith will have prepared some proposals around that, and these are now will require to be discussed not only with the new Chief Constable but also with the Scottish Police Authority, who will need to be comfortable with them before they're formally submitted to us. So I suspect that's why they've not as yet been forthcoming. I
understood the details were in hand. but they just hadn't been shared with us. And I would have thought in preparing the business case, government would have been interested to know where these savings would come from. From top of my head, I think it was about 22 million in the first year, 44 in the second and subsequent years. So it's the kind of £100 million once we get to the end of the 3-year process. I would have thought that you would have taken some interest in where these savings would come from in order that we'd have comfort. As the Cabinet Secretary knows, I'm a very great supporter of a single police force. It's not an argument against a single police force. It's the comfort of knowing it's going to work.
Well, I think what we did hear from both Vic Emery and Steve House when he gave evidence here was that they thought there was no funding gap has been put, that there was matters that savings had to be managed through. Again, coming back to the points I made to Jenny Mara, it's not for me to direct on that, but Steve did think that although it was challenging, that they would be able to do it. I, as I say, don't wish to interfere or risk being challenged by the committee for interfering in police matters, given that for a while, and I know it wasn't yourself, Mr Pearson, for a while one of the great fears of the single police service was that there would be interference from myself. But I am due to meet the chair of the authority later this week, and I will undertake to raise with him that there are concerns here, and can, as matters become clearer, can he make it, available to the committee. So as I say, I certainly accept the evidence given by Chief Constable House and indeed Vic Emery that they believe that these matters are underway. They are capably managed. They will be managed, but I will ask them to ensure that they provide that and share that information wherever is possible.
To move on, you mentioned the operational independence in your responses to Jenny Mara, and you've talked about the fears that were generated in the earlier discussions about interference. The convener for the SPSA announced that the authority will provide strategic leadership to the police. He added last week that matters involving direction and control of officers are rightly a matter for the Chief Constable. But he made it clear that he would employ all police staff and that he would maintain corporate services in relation to human resources, finance, marketing and other important functions for the board to manage. Can you give us some insight into your understanding of operational independence? And do you not feel that in holding at board level the management of staff and corporate services and believing that their purpose in life is to provide strategic leadership to the police, it's going to make for a very difficult relationship with the Chief Constable? And would he confirm or otherwise that he's aware of growing discomfort in relation to these matters, and has he had any discussions with the various post holders, including Sir Peter Howson?
Well, I haven't had discussions on this matter with Sir Peter Howson, but I have had discussions, as I have on a regular basis, with both the chair of the authority, given his appointment, and indeed with the new Chief Constable, given his appointment. And indeed, the Chief Constable and I met with the Cabinet Secretary for Health and the Director of Public Health at a meeting just recently. So there are ongoing matters. I think what we've got to recognise is that it's enshrined in statute that the Scottish Police Authority is there to both scrutinise and maintain the police service of Scotland. It has both a historic, if we can put it that way, in looking at what has been done, but it also does have some contemporary matters to look at.
Can I just for a minute, I just wonder where this fits into the budget. I know you've concerns about the roles of SPA and the Chief Constable, but we are scrutinising the budget, so I want us to focus on the budgetary implications.
Well, I think when it comes to how we deliver the spend in the first 2 years, if we've got elements of the budget being maintained at board level and managed by them separately from the Chief Constable, it's of interest to know
that's helpful. That's helpful.
Well, these matters are, as I say, we have a Chief Constable that is new in office, we have a board that has only newly been appointed, and a chair of the authority. There are ongoing discussions. I have no reason to believe that a happy accord in terms of interpretation will not be reached, and it seems to me that, as I say, there's an acceptance by both sides that the responsibility of the chief is operational, but clearly that is not simply in terms of moving police officers about Scotland. Okay. And equally, that the responsibility of the board is not simply to look at what has been done, but also what is being done. And as I say, I think we have to give the newly appointed individuals an opportunity to discuss this and work it out. I am meeting, as I said earlier, with the chair of the authority later this week, and I'll doubtless be meeting with the chief as well. So I understand your concerns, and I can give you an assurance that these matters are being chivied along.
I think that
Chivied along.
Chivied, oh, it's a quaint term.
It's a friendly way of doing things.
Doesn't it?
I hope that the Cabinet Secretary will bear in mind that as someone who understands that to do these things well, it requires the levers to enable the job to be done properly. I see from a quote from the convener, he indicates that he's a businessman and he sees policing through that lens, and he equates the Chief Constable to a Chief Operations Officer. And when I asked the convener last week about democratic oversight, he indicated that his way of managing board meetings and his transparent and open communication is his way of doing business. And from a democratic point of view, I think that such an approach satisfied what needs to be done. I think there are subtleties in this new relationship that we look forward to. I understand in our previous conversations you're sensitive to those subtleties, but I would ask you to be aware that there is a growing sensitivity amongst the service about these issues.
You have that on the record.
Thank you.
Major point, but I do want to keep to the budget.
Final brief question. Going back to the Federation issue and some of the matters that they've raised, there is a very particular sensitivity about pensions and the way in which pensions will be managed. There seems to be a position from the Federation that suggests that the government can take an individual approach to pensions in Scotland and would be able to draw together their own approach about retirement age and financing the pension pot from the future. Have you thought about these matters, and do you have any advice that you could share with us?
Well, we've been corresponding with the UK government, in particular on this, not just on police, but indeed on prison officer pensions. I made it quite clear that I thought the position of the UK government seeking to have prison officers work to the age of 68 is unacceptable. I think there are some jobs that are restricted by ageing capacity. That's dealt with by the local government scheme over which we have no control. Police and fire is slightly different, but I think the matter has been made quite clear by the General Secretary, who has written out every individual officer where, by whatever levers we have sought to be able to deal with, have also been closed down, if I can put it that way, by the UK government. So I have sympathised greatly with the Police Federation. We have sought to raise the issues that they are concerned about with not just the Home Secretary but primarily the Treasury, but in these matters sadly we have been rebuffed, and I'm grateful that the Police Federation have made it clear where the position lies.
Thank you. Rod, followed by Sandra, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to commence just asking a couple of questions, really, for the record. We talked about police station closures. What Chief Constable House said in evidence is that he could give a guarantee that he would try to avoid any police station closures. It'd be the last thing we'd want to do, but there have been occasions in the past 5 years when we have closed police stations with public acceptance and support. Any comment on that?
Well, I think that's sensible and pragmatic. We live in a world that changes. I mean, when I first moved into the home I lived in Newington, there was a police station round the corner. It closed because we opened a newer one in St Leonards and they closed some other ones. These things ebb and flow as society do. I mean, clearly police stations have an important role in communities. That's why they look clearly at it. But as I say, I think I said earlier, where the figures were coming for that were bandied around is the fact that we do have back office administration that we're currently doing 8 times over. That cannot be sustained in the financial pressures we face, cannot be sustained as we go to a single service. But police stations, as I say, are in a different category. Sometimes, though, the communities move, and therefore you have to move with them.
Fine, thank you. The Chief Constable House also talked, as Ms Maher has commented on, open and honest negotiation with staff associations or unions about terms and conditions. But he also said, I imagine that the association will agree to terms and conditions that it sees as beneficial to its members. It will not agree to anything that it sees as detrimental to its members. Any comment on that?
Well, I think the Scottish Police Federation are not shy, quite correctly, in coming forward to look after the interests of their members. I have great faith in them, and I have no doubt that where there are any difficulties, as there sometimes will be between employers and employees, they'll be treated fairly by the employers, but those who represent the employees will not be shy in coming forward to look after the interests, quite correctly, of their members.
If I could move on now to the question of funding of approximately 300 police officers, which are currently funded by local authorities. I think in the past it's been suggested the government expects local authorities to continue to provide extra police funding for this. But have there been any kind of recent discussions about this going forward?
Well, we have regular discussions with COSLA, and obviously the matters were raised both by myself today and previously by David McCletchie. The powers will continue for local authorities to continue to do that. All our information to date is that local authorities welcome the benefits that those specific officers do, because they're brought in for specific tasks in their own communities, and we have no reason to believe that the circumstances will change.
That's fine for me.
Sandra.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Convener, good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Can I just thank you for your opening statements, particularly the situation with the falling in homicides. I think that is absolutely excellent, particularly in my area in Strathclyde. Can I touch on one particular issue? Convener, it's been raised on a number of occasions, that's the operational independence. It's to do with the budget as well, obviously, if I could just touch...
There was no fussing at that moment, but I'm now listening very carefully.
Thank you, yes, I've raised it. If I could just touch on that particular one. Cabinet Secretary, we heard from numerous witnesses regarding, basically the police force and the operational independence, and actually Unison also said that Scottish Police Authority and Chief Constable should be able to decide the correct balance of police officers and police staff, and also Chief Constable House had given evidence to that as well. Now, obviously, I'm not going to ask you if you agree with that because you've already mentioned that, but one of the issues that Chief Constable House raised was that the gap between the current costs of policing and the proposed budget for next year. He mentioned it would be something around £70 million, but he also said in his comments that let me be clear, I believe that the budget is doable, as does my chairperson. Now, I'm linking that with the operational independence, Cabinet Secretary also. Could you perhaps confirm the figure that Chief Constable House has mentioned and comment on perhaps how you see the savings will be achieved, bearing in mind of the independence of Chief Constable House and the single police force? Well,
it's not a funding gap. You're quite correct. Both the chair of the SPA and Chief Constable House confirmed in evidence that the budget for 2013-14 was sufficient. They do recognise, though, that savings are needed, and part of that will be police reform, which will protect and improve local services despite financial cuts. Most, I think, of the 70 million that relates is the savings expected through police reform, and I think that's 41.8 million in 2013-14, and resources available within the Police Central Government budget to support the SPA deliver these reform savings. Other matters were coming through the SPSA in terms of inflationary challenges, but as I say, I am confident from both the evidence of Vic Emery and Steve House that the budget that has been provided for them has no gap, and that the current challenges that they face will be met. They will be dealt with by them, not, as I say, by me interfering. Doubtless they will keep myself and indeed the committee appraised of what they are doing, but as I say, it's been made quite clear that they don't see a difficulty. It's not easy, I should say, but they do expect to be able to meet it.
Mm-hmm. Chair, can I just come on with mentioned police reforms, Cabinet Secretary, and we heard evidence once again from all the various groups and branches of police force, trade unions, etc. One of the issues that they did raise was the difference in police support staff and police. And I must say, I think I commented, and it can be seen in the official report, that everyone had a different version to say, depending on what group they represented. Now, Chief Constable House and others said that in no way would staff be made redundant, and there would be other ways of these staff having jobs. It's a thorny issue, and I think it has to be raised. Can you give us any assurances that, obviously, with the independence of single police force and the chief constable, that staff will not be made redundant? There will be no voluntary redundancy.
We've made it quite clear that there will be no compulsory redundancies. There have obviously been ongoing voluntary redundancy schemes, in particular, and it may be aware, since I think some of it would be in your own constituency in forensic science and matters there. So as I say, there have been ongoing voluntary redundancy schemes. These exist in the current service and may or may not apply thereafter. But Mr Emery, as the chair of the authority, has accepted as part of the broader public sector position we take as a government, there will be no compulsory redundancies. And clearly, as I say, whilst there are challenges given the cuts coming in from Westminster, Chief Constable House recognises the important role, indeed in many instances a role that cannot be provided by police officers given the specific nature of the skills that is provided by support staff, and that's a matter for the authority and the chief.
Mm-hmm. Thank you,
On now to courts. I've already got John Finney and Jenny Mara bidding, so any other bids for courts? I'll take Graham next and then Rod after that. So, John.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, I want to ask about the ongoing consultation the Scottish Court Services due to be completed at the end of the next month on the court structure. Excuse me, and in particular, Shrieval specialisations, the High Court Circuit. And if I can allude to a comment we received in writing from the Public and Commercial Services Union, and I quote, "We believe the proposed reduction in the budget for the Scottish Court Service is dependent upon acceptance of the recommended court closures. This would prejudice the consultation currently underway and also make more difficult the proper scrutiny by Parliament of the proposals which will emanate from the consultation." Is there a linkage? What flexibility exists within that? Because and clearly there are other reforms coming, the Victims and Witnesses Bill and the issues around IT and all of this.
Well, it is a consultation document, and ultimately, as well as consulting and being considered by the SCS, it ultimately has to come here, and I have to come before you with any matter that the Lord President and the Scottish Court Service wish to consider. But the consultation paper makes clear that the consultation is about providing a court structure that provides Scotland's citizens with services and facilities consistent with the standards of a modern system, is ready to support anticipated reforms effectively, and is affordable. So there is that caveat, but not to the extent I think suggested. Parliament will ultimately have the opportunity to judge whether any court closure proposals brought forward after the consultation meet all three of these challenges, and ministers won't prejudge the consultation process, but no doubt tough choices will have to be made. So as I say, I think SCS has tried to put matters within an envelope that exists. We'll see what the consultation brings, and obviously we still have the further fail-safe that we have to come here.
Can I ask in relation to future capital implications that would arise from that? Because some of the proposals contained in that propose the retention of courts which aren't of the best standard at the expense of courts of which there's been recent upgrading. Is there a plan in place for future capital implications arising from any outcome of this?
Well, we do accept that the budget is tight, but, not doing anything about a court's estate, which is not fully fit for purpose, where we have had changes in communities, is difficult and unacceptable. Some of these matters will just have to be worked through by the Scottish Court Service. Within my 5 years, we have had ongoing matters relating to the High Court, and some of those difficulties come to do with the nature and the complexity of the building, and the challenges there. So nobody disputes that there are challenges for the Scottish Court Service. That is partly the reason that they're consulting. It's not solely. It has to be affordable, but we have to recognise the changes. We have to recognise the changes that are coming in technology as well as the changes that have occurred in society. So I don't think I can prejudge where or what they do, but some of this is, as I say, to make sure that we do what we can to maintain the existing fabric.
Can you comment, please, on the suggestion that savings made in the court budget are simply transferred in respect of witnesses' costs to the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Services budget?
Colin, do you want?
Well, I think that's covered in the Court Service consultation document, and I think in some of the evidence that Eric McQueen gave last time. I think the Court Service consulted quite extensively with the other justice organisations, and my recollection from the evidence is that they all said that the costs would be neutral or small savings. I think in relation to the Fiscal Service, there are clearly some swings and roundabouts in that they may have to pay expenses for a few more people with some more people with more expensive travel, but there will be savings in other respects, as Eric McQueen I think said. And some of the closures have actually been some people spending less time or less money travelling to court than they are otherwise. So that analysis has been done by the Crown Office, and I think they gave evidence themselves that said that they anticipated that overall there wouldn't be a significant cost impact on them.
And I just want to ask for I don't know if we all accept that, by the way, but can I just ask you? You said, Cabinet Secretary, that when the hit list is there, as it were, it would have to come here. Can you just confirm what the process would be? Is it subordinate legislation? Is it negative or affirmative? What would be the process?
To clarify, Colin?
It would be subordinate legislation. I apologise that at the moment I couldn't honestly tell you whether it's negative or positive, but we'll certainly confirm that to the committee.
Thank you very much. Sorry, John. Just one second. That right. Jenny, followed by Graham, followed by Rod.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, the Scottish Court budget will be cut in real terms by 5.5 million 13-14 and a total of 10.9 million between 12-13 and 14-15. Aren't these budget reductions the driving reason behind your proposal for court closures in Scotland?
Well, we're facing huge budget cuts from Westminster. This is the world in which we live, Ms Mara. I do wish that rather than spending $350 million on a further upgrade of Trident, we even got a Barnett share of that so that we could do sensible things that might be matters such as the court. It might be in dealing with the cold winter and the problems people have in heating their homes. But we face significant budget cuts. Every area of our portfolio faces challenges. The court service is but one, and I'm very grateful to the Lord President and to the staff of the Scottish Court Service for the job that they are doing, trying to maintain that in terms of these pressures. If, though, you think that our budget is too little, then perhaps you should tell us where it should be cut from.
So you're saying, Cabinet Secretary, that it is the budget that's driving the court closure proposals?
No, I think there's a variety of matters. I think I gave you the reason that we have to make sure that courts are up to date. Some of our courts are very old. They're not the easiest to deal with for the improvement of modern technology, which is a matter I know the committee want to bring in. Sometimes, actually, it's very difficult to configure modern technology into old buildings. Equally, towns and communities change and move, and that was a matter, I think, being commented on by John Finney and was indeed touched upon in response by Colin Mackay. So this is about looking at the start of the 21st century at a court estate that in many instances has been with us since the 19th century. Sir Walter Scott presided in these matters, and I know that's a matter known and deep to the heart of the convener. Whether that is still the position in 21st century Scotland when communities have changed, that is a matter that, I think the court service has to look at. So, yes, it has to be done within a budget. It is a challenging budget because Westminster is imposing huge cuts upon the Scottish Government and indeed prefers to upgrade weapons of mass destruction and look after the fabric of our communities. And we have to operate within that. But equally, we have to make sure that the court estate is best placed to deal with the challenges of the 21st century and really, indeed, the changes that our communities and towns have happened. Within my lifetime, long before I became Justice Secretary, when I first qualified as a lawyer, I grew up in the town of Linlithgow. That was where the Sheriff Court was. The Sheriff Court was there, and I don't know if Mr Pearson ever appeared in the evidence there. It was because it was historically Linlithgow Shire. The biggest community in West Lothian, formerly Linlithgow Shire, is Livingston. It made sense to move the court to Livingston because more people were having to travel from Livingston to Linlithgow than would go from Linlithgow to Livingston. So that has to be factored in. So there is a budget. It is a tight, difficult budget, and I am grateful for the outstanding service that the Lord President and the Court Service are trying to do within that. But equally, as we're now into the second decade of the 21st century, I think we need to look at What courts do we require? Where do we require them? Are they capable of dealing with the challenges of modern technology that we all want to bring in?
So we're in quite a heady period of legal reform at the moment, with the changes recommended in the Carloway review and the reduction to the drink driving limit that we debated in Parliament last week. And I think these all clearly have an impact on the amount of business going through the courts. Do you think there will be an increase in court business as a result of these?
I'm not aware of any anticipated huge upturn in terms of the business as a result of the drink driving legislative change. It's a matter I am obviously driving forward. I'm grateful for the cross-party support. I have to say, if there is an increase in business, so be it. Those who are currently flouting the law and who endanger the lives of themselves and others must be dealt with. But I don't think that is a matter that causes any great distress or worry for the Scottish Court Service. And clearly, when the Lord President has driven this matter forward, he has taken into account the fundamental changes that he himself is the author for in terms of guild reforms, and indeed the matter that his deputy, the Lord Justice Clerk, Lord Carloway, is proposing in the Carloway reform. So these matters have been taken into account and are factored in.
Would it not be better to wait and see how these changes bed in, to see if there is an increase in business before steamrolling ahead with court closures?
No, I don't believe so, because I don't necessarily think that that there will be an increase in business. Any increase in business will be factored in, and this is about looking at the budget, looking at the changes in our communities, and looking at the opportunities to make use of new technology. These are matters, I went up to Kitty Brewster in Aberdeen, where they're about to build the new custody suites to replace what currently is in existence at the police HQ. They are building in matters so that matters can be dealt with through video technology. These are all sensible things. Rather than have somebody taken to the police station, from the police station to the court, from the court to the prison, we will be able to cut down needless journeys. That will be a benefit to the prisoner, but certainly benefit to the system and to the service.
Do you have any evidence that there won't be an increase in business as a result of these reforms? They've not yet been implemented. We don't really know. Have you taken any evidence that shows that? Because I think the last thing we want in our court system is further delays. They're already quite, disrupt the system.
Well, these matters have been taken into account. What we're talking about are two fundamental matters that you're referring to, are the guild reforms. He is the Lord President. He is currently the man who's dealing with this, and I'm grateful for the work he's doing here. And the Carloway reforms. Lord Carloway is the Lord Justice Clerk. Both of them, as I say, are integral part of this. They are, as I say, factored in. And as I say, I am perfectly confident that these matters are all considered, taken on board, given that in one situation it's the same individual, but given, as I say, these matters are looked at by the Scottish Court Service, they're looked at and around, not simply in terms of any increase in court business that may come around because of Carloway reforms, but also quite correctly factoring in what may come about in terms of reduction, in terms of changes, as we factor in video conferencing, linking, and I made reference to what is ongoing in Aberdeen and is happening elsewhere.
If the Cabinet Secretary were to discover that there is an increase in court business, our courts are much busier as a result of all these reforms, would he perhaps reconsider his programme of court closures? Well,
these matters have been considered by the Lord President. I'm due to meet again, as I meet regularly with the Lord President. I'm happy to give Ms Mara an undertaking that will flag up to him the concerns that you have, and either he or I can return to you. But I am, convinced and satisfied that the Lord President has taken into account the proposals that he and his colleague, the Lord Justice Clerk, have made. In Scotland, the Lord Justice General and the Lord Justice Clerk are in charge of driving forward these fundamental changes. They're factored in, and as I say, I have nothing that concerns me, but I will raise it with the Lord President on your behalf.
Thank you.
Graham, followed by Ron, please.
Just following on from some of the questions that Jenny Mara has indicated to you, could you share with us the mechanisms that you have in place for examining and assessing the impacts that arrive from Lord Gill, Lord Carloway and others' reforms? How is that factored into the budgetary processes? We've got a fairly substantial decline in budget for courts, and alongside that, an equal decline in legal aid budget. So how have you factored in, how has that work actually been done on the ground?
Well, there's a variety of factors ongoing, and I'll ask Colin Mackay to comment on that, but clearly we have the Making Justice work programme that's separate and non-statutory, because some of Lord Gill's proposals that came about several years ago, some of that did not require legislative change, some did. That's obviously why we proceed next week to stage 2 on a bill to allow matters that will allow the changes that he wishes to go forward. Other matters in terms of video conferencing, a whole array of other matters are dealt with by the Making Justice work programme. So these are not dealt with in terms of one particular silo, but they're ongoing work. But they are factored in, but I don't know if, Colin, you want to add anything.
Well, I can perhaps give a little bit more detail to that. I mean, clearly the overall envelope was set by the original spending review, and at the time of the spending review there were obviously discussions with the justice agencies in relation to the bids that were put forward and were ultimately included in the budget, including discussion with the Scottish Court Service as a separate non-ministerial department about what they needed, as it were, to live on. Following that setting of the budget and the provision, there's work going on within the individual agencies, obviously, in terms of their business and corporate planning about how they're going to live through the next period. But bringing that together, there are really two mechanisms. In terms of the reforms, as Mr McCaskill has said, the Making Justice Work Programme, which I think Mr McCaskill's written to the committee about in the past, brings together all the different kind of structural and procedural reforms. And so, to give you an example, one project of that is dealing with the Guild reforms, and that is that there is a project board which is chaired by the Chief Executive of the Scottish Court Service, and that will look at the business case for those reforms. We'll look at the implications for legal aid, it will look at the implications for the Crown and for the police, and all of these people are represented on the project boards for the individual reforms. There is an overarching programme board which has the chief executives of the Court Service, the Legal Aid Board, and the Crown Agent and a representative from the police, and they oversee that overall process. Right at the apex of the as it were, official coordination, there is a thing called the Justice Board, which looks over the piece at the work of all the agencies involved within the Justice Directorate, and that includes monitoring of finance. So looking both at planned reforms, but just generally monitoring how finance is going over the year, any contingencies have arisen and any plans that need to be taking place. So there's a fairly coherent structure there, which allows the government to work with the different justice agencies, including obviously the Independent Court Service, to ensure that the reforms are properly budgeted for and the implications for the other agencies are fully taken into account.
And can you tell me, how are the interests of victims and witnesses weighted in those arrangements? And making a judgment about saving money and then the needs of the end customer, so to speak, whether it be victims, witnesses, and indeed accused and others?
Well, to some extent, I think that's why it's overseen by the government, because the government, I suppose, has an interest in victims and witnesses. There is engagement with a wide range of organisations in the broader network within which they operate, including victim support, obviously, and organisations have an interest in particular groups such as Scottish Women's Aid. They're all spoken to on a very regular basis about all of these kind of issues. And there are political commitments to victims and witnesses which the officials within the various agencies clearly have to...
that key point about how do you weight their views, I mean, we've heard from the Cabinet Secretary the imperative of saving money.
Yes.
There's a pressure on.
Yes.
Given the views that will be expressed by these groups, when do you set the benchmark that said, the impact is just too great for us? How do you do that?
There's no formula as such. I mean, what we do, and I engage, as Colin has said, with Scottish Women's Aid, I equally meet with Victim Support Scotland, Petal and others. So to some extent, we just leave matters to be resolved in terms of people of goodwill taking matters on board, because nobody goes out of their way to try and make matters worse. We do recognise that for far too long, until I think it was certainly raised by the previous Lord Advocate, Eilish Angelini, in terms of dealing more appropriately with victims, and progress has been built on there. The current Lord Advocate, Frank McConnell, has obviously recognised, I think correctly, the problems that are faced by witnesses, not just by victims, and that's why we're proceeding with the Victims and Witnesses Bill. So there is no formula. What is required to do is to look within the budget, to take on board the views of others. You have round this table, and you have the government here to look at the interests of stakeholders, those who represent the rights of the accused, those who represent the rights of victims and witnesses, those who represent, as I say, you may say the bureaucracy or whatever. All of those required to be taken on board, and that's what we seek to do, and indeed that's why we take representations from individual members here, whether on particular matters related to the care and welfare of victims, or indeed the particular matter that many or some have had regarding the care and welfare of prisoners.
I mean, if I could
I'm
just...
advised by my deputy convener here that Frank McConnell is a dancer.
Yes.
And it's, I think, Frank Mulholland.
Frank Mulholland.
Or maybe
My
Frank
apology to my
Mulholland
friend.
dances as well. Who knows? We'll find out one day.
One
No,
last...
you were going to come in with something, Mr.
Just a small supplemental to that. I mean, in relation to the courts programme, which obviously is brought forward by the Scottish Court Service, I know that the concerns of victims and witnesses were a very anxious concern to the judiciary, and I think that was one of the reasons why, before the Court Service developed its plans, the Lord President laid down principles of access to justice, which are included in the document, the consultation document, and these were to guide the Court Service in how they took their plans forward, and these included the desirability of criminal justice being delivered locally, the requirements of it being possible to travel within the day wherever possible, to provide proper facilities for victims and witnesses in courtrooms. So the concerns of victims and witnesses were really with the parameters that were set when the Court Service had to go away and work out how it was going to deliver the savings.
Last question, it's on corroboration and the impact of the use of corroboration in budgets and government budgets looking forward. In the event that the legislation does pass and there's a change in our approach to corroboration, would the Cabinet Secretary see a need to ensure that the area of forensic science analysis and post-mortem would still require corroborative evidence, given the experience of the way in which mistakes can on occasions be made in these circumstances, and there's a special need for corroborative evidence coming from there? I mention that in terms of it's an obvious budget cut, but it might be a budget cut too far.
I was waiting for that magic word budget to slither in there, but you did it.
I mean, these
I
are
never slither, convener.
These are matters that we are consulting on. I think certainly in my experience, and I'll doubtless be the experience of Mr Pearson, as well as having the autopsy by the Crown, you usually have one in respect of the defence. I think these are matters that I think we need to see the outcome of the consultation. I think Mr Pearson makes a valid point. There have been some high-profile cases. Equally, there have been many that have gone remarkably unchallenged, but it's a matter I'm happy to give you an assurance that will be properly consulted upon.
Thanks, convener.
Thank you, Ron.
In relation to the maintenance budget for the courts, the written submission from the Scottish Court Service states that the proposed capital funding would leave little for ongoing maintenance over the next 2 years. In written evidence, the acting chief executive, I think, has confirmed that the SCS has a maintenance backlog of 57 million. So that even if the proposals in the court reform document are implemented, it's actually potentially a drop in the ocean against that maintenance backlog. So going forward beyond the 2 years, unless there is a substantial improvement in the government's financial position from somewhere, the court service is going to be under considerable pressure.
They are under pressure. That's why the status quo is not tenable, and that's why, as I say, they are consulting upon making changes. You are correct that the challenges still exist, and these are matters that, as were being discussed upon before, how do you balance these matters? Well, that's the art of politics. How do you decide what you're going to put in health as opposed to what you're going to put in justice or put in education? So this is a budget that we believe is appropriate, that covers the needs for the Scottish Court Service at the present moment. It's not simple, it's not easy. Equally, once we come to a further spending review, then it might be that the priorities there will have to be raised. That's how, as I say, matters operate. As a government, we've preserved health. We think that's important to the well-being of the people of Scotland. It's a matter disagreed with by opposition parties, but you have to just take the decision there. So we believe, and Eric McQueen has confirmed this, that the budget is manageable. It's not easy, as indeed is the same across all the portfolio. We wish we weren't here, but the cuts are coming in from Westminster, and we don't have any alternative way of dealing with it. So we work with the stakeholders, with the institutions, and I think together we've got a fair, appropriate balance. But I think the point you make is a valid point, and it's a matter that will have to be considered and renewed once again in due course.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, I'm going to ask a question. It's a bit of a surprise, but because the committee is really focused on criminal procedures and court closures, and most people aren't involved in that. It's civil matters that are involved in, and I think of things like small claims, adoption, child welfare hearings, matrimonial, contact, residential, interdicts, interim interdicts. Now, all of these matters, especially things like interim interdicts, maybe an interim contact and so on, need to be heard pretty quickly. All the people who might be involved are very local. I have concerns that civil work, which we tend to put back and not think about, will be prejudiced with the closure of courts, rural courts. And last week I asked whether it would be possible for civil work. I appreciate custody has to be there for criminal work. You have to have certain assets. You have to have jails and so on, or custody suites. But that for civil work, could this not, in cases, be held in other buildings within an area? Because there you've got the social work department, you've got the GP or whatever, all on site, able to give evidence at hearings or at interim hearings. So what's your view on that?
I think that's a matter for the court service. I've got no real view on it, and I have to say, in my past experience as an agent, I did appear at referrals from children's panels in Dundee at that time were dealt with in a separate building and not in the Sheriff Court structure. The Sheriff moved to a separate building elsewhere. A lot of this depends upon what's available. Some of it also has to be counterbalanced with the greater specialisation that we face in legislation, because I haven't practised law for 13 years, but I do remember when I practised law in Edinburgh, which is one of our larger sheriffdoms, not every sheriff, very few sheriffs did adoptions. There was usually one sheriff in particular. At one stage it was Sheriff McNeill. It was replaced, I think, by Sheriff Scott. They did the adoptions. Other sheriffs didn't do adoptions. We now have mental health. We have guardianship, all these matters where I know from experience, from discussion with the court service, there are many instances in which there is only one sheriff in the particular locality who can or does deal with it. So I think the point you make is valid. To some extent, it's a point I think raised in terms of police stations. I frequently go to places now where the police officer is not in the police station. He's in the same building where the council offices are, where the social work offices are, and frankly it makes a lot more sense because the same people tend to be going in quite often in multiple issues. That, I think, applies to the same. If there is an opportunity to deal with that, I think that would be a good thing. It might, though, be that the particular sheriff who is now dealing with a specialisation in adoption and mental health and guardianship or whatever, that sheriff is elsewhere. So whether it's the building, whether it's new technology, I think we need to be prepared to break out of the situation that we have, that it has to be this one court with this one sheriff. I think in the world in which we live, that cannot be done because that court might or cannot be there, and indeed in some instances that particular sheriff will not be there because that sheriff will not have the skills, and it's no criticism of them, but that sheriff will not have the skills to be able to deal with a particular aspect.
Accepting your argument, which I do, about specialisms within sheriffs, and that's been going for a long time, nevertheless there are not only issues about access to justice and people being able, there are costs involved, and I would therefore say that I'm very sceptical of the fact that we're getting cost neutral about court closures when I can see issues in civil work where a social worker, a GP, various people might have to travel into a city rather than give their evidence in a locus within the community. Not only would it be cost of their travel, it would be cost of their time and so on. So I challenge it on those grounds. I accept that where there has to be custodial suites, we're maybe looking at a different situation. But I did want to draw attention to the fact that civil work is the majority of the work that people in Scotland have contact with in the courts, and that we mustn't overlook that when we're looking at the costs in access to justice and also the actual financial costs if it's moved moved into a place 40 or 50 miles away.
Well, I'd accept that, but equally I think it has been pronounced from on high in the court service that the BVG case, it's about how matters are dealt with, not simply where they are dealt with. And as I say, that's a matter the Lord President has my full support. I think we do have to recognise that some of these matters have to be dealt with expeditiously, but the point you make we do take on board, but equally very many, indeed the overwhelming majority of these cases do not ever go to proof.
Thank you. Sorry, I beg your pardon. I did take your answer. And before I move on, if there's any other additional questions, I know that Graham and the Cabinet Secretary is aware you want to ask this question, because I'm a bit dubious what it's got to do with the budget. But as apparently there's been some kind of consensus here behind my back, we may proceed.
I'm sorry, Convener, you agreed that you would have word passed to the Cabinet Secretary. It was a question about...
Whoops. Then I've forgotten. I'm sorry. Senior moment. Okay. Forgive me.
It's been mentioned before the committee, and there are concerns, I think, with a number of the members. Fatal accidents abroad and the ability of the details to be dealt with here by the authorities. We've had a number of responses which indicate that at some point in the future there will be legislation from government. I'd hope that you'd be able to give us some indication today when that legislation would be introduced. In the event that you find that you're too busy, would you object to someone from this Cabinet, from this committee, taking the matter forward independently?
I mean, these are matters, obviously, in terms of the parliamentary timetable, are not within my domain. What I can say is we are committed to implementing Lord Cullen's matters. It's not simply in terms of deaths abroad, but the broader aspects that Lord Cullen looked at, because the FEI legislation is now from a past century and we have to progress it. So I can reaffirm the commitment that we will, bring in the legislation before the end of this government. In precise timetable I cannot give. We are doing what we can and have already, as I say, managed now to implement the position for military deaths abroad, and that's something I'm grateful for the both support from south of the border and indeed for the excellent work carried out by the Lord Advocate, Frank Mulholland, I will get on record, and indeed, as I say, the other aspects where some of the clear issues that have been brought to me by individual concerned citizens don't so much require a legislative change, they perhaps require an improvement in terms of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office interaction with individuals. And that's a matter, again, to be fair, I think the FCO are seeking to address. So all I can say is that's a matter you may care to discuss with Minister for Parliamentary Business, but I can give you the assurance that we are committed to it, and in the interim, whether it's... No.
I think that's it. We don't need to. I think he smiled. I think that means he's happy. Can I thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary and officials, for your attendance. And I'm now going to suspend for 10 minutes because we move on to the next session on Court and Vale. Right. So what are you going to? Thank you very much. Back to business and moving on to item 5 on the agenda, Commission on Women Offenders. This is an evidence session on the Cabinet Secretary's report to Parliament on progress, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that. It was very useful last week. In relation to the Commission on Women Offenders recommendations, we will also cover any budgetary issues relating to women offenders at this session. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and Joe Griffin, Deputy Director of Community Justice at the Scottish Government, for remaining with us for this item. I welcome Colin McConnell, Chief Executive of the SPS. I think this is your second visit. You've hardly your foot in the door, and here you are back again. Now, could I ask the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement and then questions from members, please?
Nothing
to say.
Happy to go straight to questions.
Wonderful, wonderful. That's it then. And now questions, please. Alison.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, this time last year you were, I think it would be fair to say, quite scornful of my pursuit of a replacement for Cornton Vale. Let me just read you the official report. If you wish me to commit to, or take up a Lib Dem announcement, if that's what it is, that we should build a replacement for Cornton Vale, then tell me where the money should come from, because it would probably cost 140 million. I cannot ask the SPS to build a replacement for Cornton Vale. Well, I mean, I welcome the change of heart. I do genuinely welcome it. It was desperately needed.
That was just wonderful, Alison.
But do you now, it's a serious point, do you now consider that you were poorly advised by the previous management of SPS on this matter?
No, I don't. I think what we are doing is responding to the Angelini Commission report. That's why we're here. We're here to discuss Dame Eilish Angelini's report. She did mention the unsuitability of Cornton Vale. It was a matter that has resonated in terms of comments by the HM Inspector of Prisons, and we are therefore seeking to address the Angelini Commission report, one aspect of which was Cornton Vale. They've made it clear we never, as I say, doubted the problems that existed in Cornton Vale, but we're happy to accept the position put down by that, and that's why I'm grateful to Colin McConnell for pressing on with how we will replace it. It will take time, but we've given a commitment to find the money, and I'm grateful for my Cabinet colleague, the Secretary for Finance, in assisting us in that.
Well, we didn't really need the Eilish Angelini report to know that there were problems at Cornton Vale, because Brigadier Hugh Munro and indeed this committee had pressed you for a long time, and it was really unfortunate, I think, the attitude the SPS took to it. And that's what goes to the heart of the next question. I want to understand what changes have been put in place that will meet the challenge of changing the culture throughout the SPS on this matter, and will put women offenders properly on the agenda.
Well, I'll get Colin to comment shortly, but it seems to us that the Angelini Commission is looking matters holistically. It's not simply about women who are in prison, it's about women who may be put into prison, and how can we seek to divert them from going there if it's not appropriate. Prison will always be the place for some offenders, women or others, and that is accepted by Dame Eilish Angelini, but far too many go there who would be better diverted to alternative matters. Equally, it's not simply a matter of once they are in prison, it's how do we deal with them when they are liberated, as they will be. And clearly on that matter, my colleague Joe Griffin and his team are rising to the challenge there. So Cornton Vale is one particular aspect. There are far too many, we accept it, prisoners there at the present moment, some of whom may be better dealt with elsewhere. We have to deal with the prison estate, and that is a matter that the prison service is addressing. Equally, we have to make sure that less come in, that they're dealt with in other ways that will treat their difficulties, so that we address their offending, because it's not that they're not offending, it's simply that prison would not necessarily be the best solution to alleviate matters. And those who do require to go to prison because of the nature of offence, that we try to break the cycle of offending. But I don't know if, Colin, you want to comment at all on the culture or other?
Well, certainly in responding directly to the issue. SPS undoubtedly had a long-standing strategic planning approach. And I think what Dame Eilish's report has enabled me to do as an incoming Chief Executive is to look at that planning afresh, but with the benefit of Dame Eilish's report, which of course the previous administration up until that point did not have. So in looking at the issues crystallised in the Women's Commission's recommendations, it's given us the opportunity to, as I say, take that fresh approach not just in terms of the longer term planning, but what opportunities SPS has in the short term to respond speedily and meaningfully to the powerful recommendations that Dame Eilish has made. And that's why I put forward the proposals that I did do to the Cabinet Secretary, and really pleased that the Cabinet Secretary has picked up on them and we're able to move forward in the way that we're proposing.
On that, can I ask Mr Connell, would you personally lead the work, that holistic work that is needed? Yeah.
Yes, and of course it was one of Dame Eilish's essentially 6 recommendations aimed at the prison service. I mean, what Dame Eilish recommended was that effectively someone should be brought into SPS to sit at board level, not a sort of non-exec role, to drive the initiative forward. And I think we can all understand why Dame Eilish made those or that particular recommendation. It seemed to me that in the spirit, what she was saying was, someone needs to get a grip of this at a senior level and drive it on. For my part, I don't think that needs someone independent or someone new. I just think the Chief Exec needs to get a grip of it and drive it on, and I think that's what I'm doing.
Well, I think that's very welcome, and I think if the head of the organisation recognises that this is an issue that needs to be tackled in that way, then I'm hopeful that the culture within SPS itself will change with you, and I'm sure we'll keep an eye on it. I'm well aware, Cabinet Secretary, that the Angelini report covers much more than Cornton Vale itself, but I'm sure other colleagues will touch on the other issues in it. But I do want to focus a little bit longer on Cornton Vale and the issues there. Last week, Mr McConnell, you advised us that you expected the new prison would cater for 300 women, and yet we've heard the Cabinet Secretary say there's far too many women in prison, and that part of the Angelini report is to find other ways of dealing with it. And the report itself recommended basically a smaller national prison for those on long-term sentences or those who needed to be there for the safety of the public. Does this represent a change and a general shift away from that part of the Angelini report?
No. Yeah, sure. I think there's, in a sense, more than one part to answering your question, and you're quite right, as you did last week, to focus me in on what seems to be a deviation or a disconnect with where Dame Eilish wants us to go. But in reality, I don't think it is a disconnect. I think it's part of a journey to get us to where the Commission want us to be, and that is essentially smaller units targeting in a more focused way on the many and varied special issues that confront women offenders, and more particularly women in custody. But we've got to start somewhere. Today there's 451 women in custody across the Scottish Prison Service, with over 250 currently placed at Cornton Vale. And I think we all recognise and accept that Cornton Vale is a place out of time, and we need to do something much better, and our approach to that is to replace it. Now that's going to be, as you know, at Inverclyde. But if you look back in terms of the history of the population growth of women in custody, over 20 years, the population has grown over 200%. So we've got to be mindful that whatever we design, certainly in the short to medium term, has to be capable of managing a population that we have now, but begin to then put in place those strategies, those approaches, those services that will ultimately lead to that population turning down and effectively reducing. So my counsel, if you like, my professional advice to the Cabinet Secretary and to this committee is that we should plan to provide a proper resource for women in custody, but especially targeted, as you have been pressing me to do, but ultimately has to be able to cope with a population of between 450 and, say, 480. Historically, that's where we've been, but with the absolute imperative to put in place proper support services that in time will turn that population down, and that's really what we're about.
That's useful. If I might continue, I'm glad that you touched on that, because problems at Conton Vale run deep and they go far beyond the state of the buildings. I mean, we've got how mental health issues are dealt with or indeed not dealt with at the moment, prolonged segregation of women prisoners or of some women prisoners, family access and insufficient access to education and training. These are all issues that have been highlighted time and time again. What provisions will you put in the new prison, particularly in terms of capacity, actual physical space to deal with some of the mental health issues, to deal with access to education and training? I'd be interested to hear.
Well, and of course, Dame Eilish set out rather an extensive list of services that she recommends that we must and really should provide. And I can say that our approach, not just to the provision at Inverclyde, but we talked last week about the sort of hub and spokes approach, is that we intend, and it's certainly part of the design, the emerging design brief for Inverclyde and then subsequently the new regional unit at Edinburgh, to ensure that there is specialist targeted provision across the landscape of necessary needs for women in custody. So, for example, there will be a particular unit at Inverclyde which will be designed to deal with women with particular mental health problems. There will be extensive education facilities provided at Conton Vale, and of course in the spokes out into the community-facing environment, which are designed to integrate with community services to ensure that we get that continuity between custody and the community. So the recommendations that are set out in Dame Eilish's report are being brought to life, not just, as you've said, in the physical structures, but also in the relationships and the service provision that we're going to put in place.
Okay. And probably my final question for the moment, if you allow me, is what will happen in the transition, and are there enough budgetary provision there to help deal with the existing problems that need tackled before Inverclyde opens?
Yes, there is. Yeah. And again, I think it's important that the committee appreciates that. I'm not coming here doing the bleeding stumps presentation. I mean, the Cabinet Secretary of the Scottish Government has made sure that the Scottish Prison Service is appropriately resourced to do the business that it has to do. And that actually includes the necessary improvements that we've got to make pro tem at Conton Vale. So these are already funded. I've set that money aside. So we'll see some significant improvements to the living accommodation at Conton Vale. We'll see the development of a family centre at Conton Vale, which we fully intend will be operational by the spring. We're also looking to, as you know, improve the training of staff who work with women. That's already in place and being brought forward. And we will, where necessary, pump prime additional targeted service delivery for women at Conton Vale, whilst we bring on the more medium-term improvements at Inverclyde and at Edinburgh.
Thank you. Thanks, Camilla.
Thank you. I've got a long list. I'll read it out. But Colin, then Rod, then Sandra, then Graham, then John. Colin.
Thank you. Good morning. The Angelini Commission highlighted the problem of prisoners experiencing delays in accessing entitlements upon release from prison, including the effect of the prospect of them reoffending. You mentioned in your letter, Cabinet Secretary, that you had a meeting with the UK Minister for Welfare Reform. Is there anything that the Scottish Government can do to mitigate this problem? And more generally, do you have a sense of what impact the UK Government's welfare reforms will have on this group?
Well, there is an issue there. I think you correctly raised that. I did have a meeting with Lord Freud some months back. We are working on a pilot project with the WP for trying to ensure that women leaving HMP Conton Vale will be able to receive benefits immediately upon release, and this is planned to be established in April of 2013. Equally, as a government, we are investing in services to try and make sure, for example, that mentors will meet women at gates as they come out through the Change Fund and community justice centres, and that will help support them. but I wouldn't underestimate the challenges that the prison service and indeed the criminal justice system will face with welfare reform that is coming in. But as I say, I am grateful to Lord Floyd for considering this pilot project, and as I say, we are taking steps ourselves.
Could I? Is it fair to say that there is a more than fair chance that the number of women coming into the justice system is going to rise because of these benefit reforms?
I don't know. I think it makes great difficulty. I mean, I think, to be fair, received wisdom was in a recession the crime rate would rise. That has not been the case. But I don't think we should underestimate the huge problem that would be faced, partly in terms of the change to monthly payments or whatever, that will be felt in particular by women, but will equally be felt by men and by youngsters. There are huge problems there. So we are doing what we can in terms of the prison estate and indeed in terms of how we deal with those who are discharged and liberated from prison, in terms of trying to meet with them, engage with them before they're released and when they're released. But as I say, the broader social matter would probably be better commented on by others, but I would be denying reality if I thought that it wouldn't cause problems, because it will cause hardship, and when there is hardship, then sometimes people do matters that under other circumstances they would not consider.
Thank you. Rod, followed by Sandra, please.
The Angelini Commission was very positive about mentoring, which we were talking about a few minutes ago, as providing necessary support and ultimately helping in reducing reoffending. What's the government doing to try and encourage as many women as possible into mentoring?
Well, we're working with a variety of matters through the Change Fund. I myself have met with SACRO, who are dealing with it in a particular number of areas where they're bringing in ex-offenders themselves, as indeed supported by others. So there's a variety of matters that we're seeking to work with people, to engage with people, to give them the support before they leave, and then certainly when they leave. But I don't know if, Joe, if you want to elaborate some more.
Yeah. I think mentoring is very important, because a lot of these issues are not just about how vulnerable people, not just how the services are provided, but how vulnerable people actually access them. Quite often the terms in which people leave prison are very undesirable. They're predictably just before the weekend when services are not open. Drug dealers often know exactly when their clients are coming out and are waiting for them. And by getting more service user feedback, we've come to understand the real life experience of people leaving prison. So our thinking behind expanding the range of mentoring services available was really that side of the equation, to try and get people to link in with the services that exist already, that they're entitled to as citizens, as well as looking at the specialist requirement for particular types of service to respond to those circumstances. So specifically, in setting up the Reducing Reoffending Change Fund, we and partners took the view that that should be devoted to the expansion of mentoring services across the board. And there is £7.5 million available for this over the 3 years of the spending review period, and we've now allocated the funds for the first year, and groups working with women are among those who are receiving the funding, and we're very, very hopeful that this will be a much more effective way of supporting women and others leaving prison to access the services to which they are already entitled.
How do we ensure that projects receiving money from the Change Fund are sustainable beyond that funding cycle? For the long term, how do we ensure that?
This is the other part of the change. When we set up the fund in the spending review, we were keen to look at the change in terms of changing the way that people exit prison back into the community, but also changing the way that we fund things. There is a problem with pilots often run by the third sector proving themselves to be successful and then struggling for sustainable funding thereafter. So the particular model that we are looking at for years 2 and 3 of the Change Fund is something called a public social partnership, which is a funding model originated in Italy, whereby the third sector and statutory funders come together to co-design a service and then reach an agreement about, provided certain outcomes are met during the delivery of that service, then it will be sustained over a period of time. So we've very deliberately used the Change Fund to test that approach in Scotland, because we feel that it could be an innovative way of ensuring that the projects that really work and deliver outcomes get sustainable funding. Of course, there are still challenges with that, and we're at the early days, and I'm not making great claims for that success right now, but we do think that the analysis is right, that too many projects struggle for sustainable funding, and we're using the Change Fund to look at that head on.
I'd like to ask more about this, because this has been a running sore all the time I've been in Parliament. Short-term funding, successful projects having to redesign themselves to apply for fresh funding. So I'm encouraged by talking about a public-social partnership. Perhaps it's not today, perhaps, to tell us more about this, but I'd quite like to, if you could let the committee know more about how this will operate, and will it become the norm? I mean, we look at some timescale where voluntary sector and the public sector and the social partnership, that will be the way we use the funds. Is that what you're... And when will this happen?
I think... Well, the money has gone out for year one, which is both to support services already delivering mentoring, but also to help them, some of the recipients, the money has been to help them prepare for years 2 and 3, which will be explicitly run on the public social partnership lines. And people bidding in for the Change Fund will need to demonstrate that they have come together, statutory and third sector, to work according to those arrangements. We don't yet know what the obstacles are going to be to that working. To some extent, they remain some of the bigger obstacles in the system about the way that the money is used. But we think it's a very interesting model that's worth looking at, and that's what we're doing through the Change Fund. I think it's too soon to say we would then look to expand that so everything would be based on that. But there is a logic about it, and there is an attraction in terms of the collaborative approach that's taken and the guarantees of sustainability that are very interesting, but I wouldn't want to say more about it at this point. But the analysis and the problem is absolutely one that we share. And I suppose that would also be one of the reasons why Dame Angelini went on to look at the structures lying in behind community justice, which the Cabinet Secretary has said he believes are no longer tenable. So there are bigger structural questions at play as well.
I'll leave it there just now, but I think some of us want to return to this in due course. Sandra, followed by Graham, followed by John. Sandra.
Thank you very much, Convener. I do want to put on record my thanks to everyone who's been involved, and Alison and the committee and others as well, for what's happening in the Court and Vale at the moment. I visited a number of years ago the Equal Opportunities Committee, and since then obviously has worked along with others to see change, but this was the best committee to do that change. So I'm very, very pleased that this is happening, and some of the questions I was going to ask have already been asked, but one of the questions I do want to ask is about the collaborative joined up working together. We have the new prison coming off. We will look at improvements in Court and Vale as it stands at the moment, but my interest lies in when the women are released from prison, and it doesn't become once again a revolving door. So obviously it's the work that's being done outside, and one of the issues is housing, accommodation, for women prisoners when they are released. This is a very great difficulty in local communities, and I'm sure we all have this situation in our local communities also. Can the Cabinet Secretary and others tell me exactly just what is happening with the joined-up thinking? I've been working with housing associations, with local authorities in regards to women being rehoused, with the mentoring backup as well. Obviously, it's already been mentioned about the changes in the welfare system, and it's been answered also. I think it's really important that we have this joined-up thinking and the working together to ensure that women, once again, it doesn't become a revolving door. So I just wonder if the Cabinet Secretary could give me an update, or officials in regard to what work is actually being put in there to ensure that there isn't a revolving door again.
Yes, you're right, because we are aware that stable accommodation is a critical factor along with some other aspects, and the government is committed to tackling and preventing homelessness, and indeed that's underpinned by targets that all unintentionally homeless households will be entitled to settle accommodation by the end of 2012. So there is a government and COSLA steering group that was established in 2009, which is taking forward priorities around investing in the right areas, improving access to accommodation, developing corporate responsibility for homelessness across local authorities, and crucially, and perhaps more importantly, especially as the comments you made, preventing it before it occurs. We have established 5 local authority-led housing option hubs across Scotland, and they share good practice around preventing homelessness, and they've discussed their findings with the Dame Eilish Angelini Commission. The cross-sector supported accommodation implementation group will report at the end of this month. This group's considered the recommendations of Dame Eilish Angelini's report, and as I said in my letter, officials are also exploring different models of housing support for women leaving prison, including support in tenancy. There isn't one simple solution, and indeed, as you say, it's also about working with other partners, which is why officials are working with Glasgow City Council, GHA, and indeed Turning Point Scotland to explore options about improving access to suitable accommodation. It is about making sure there is suitable accommodation. What the accommodation for one individual might be different for others, but we do have to have that basis of support, and we've got to work with them through agencies and through partners, and that's what we're seeking to do.
Thank you very much, Convener. I know it's obviously it's about the budget, but when you're talking about women offenders, it's about making sure that they get the best possible opportunity to get rehoused. We've talked about joined up thinking, and you've given me the hubs, etc. Can you tell me what your opinion perhaps is, and when we look at the new changes of the health and social care being integrated together, will that have an impact on women offenders getting the joined up care and support that they need? And would there be regular meetings between yourselves and the new setup between health and social care when it comes about?
Well, some of these matters be more for COSLA, but we do interact with COSLA and with obviously with other government departments. I think that case is being worked at. Some of it is also to some extent about discussions are ongoing, but another aspect of the Angelini Commission review, which was about the structure or nature of whether there should be a national agency. So we are going to go out to consultation on that. I think the status quo in terms of how we deal with community justice is not really tenable, and there has to be changes there. I am and have been in discussions with COSLA. We will continue to discuss with COSLA. One option for change that will come out in a consultation document will be the proposal from Dame Eilish Angelini. But I think we need to engage with partners on this. No firm view has been taken by us, and I think what we are looking to do is to work not simply with COSLA but with ADSW to try and make sure that when the changes that come in through health and social care don't have any consequences that would be detrimental upon community or criminal justice, that we maintain the appropriate balance, because we're aware of the thoughts of ADSW about a holistic social work service, equally the views of COSLA that these things are best and we accept dealt with locally. So it's about, as I say, working towards change, because change there has to be, but taking on board the views and indeed getting the best possible input from COSLA and ADSW.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Just to remind members, it is also about the report. So it isn't just on budget. I know I was sort of hard on you in the last session, because that's what it was about. This time it's about the response to the report by Eilish Angelini and budget issues. Right? So don't feel constrained, not that many of you do. Graham, followed by John, please.
Thanks, Convener. First of all, Cabinet Secretary, I think it would be right that I would record how helpful I found the thoughtful explanations given to us both last time round and this time from Colin McConnell. I think that the inventiveness that he's displayed in resolving some of these issues is to be applauded. And the sting in the tail is I look forward to the same inventiveness when it comes to the men in prison and what faces them for the future. My question's about the HMI, the role of the HMI in these matters. The HMI reported his concerns in relation to Corton Vale, and then 18 months later returned and felt sufficiently moved that he reported that he'd observed no change in respect of Corton Vale in the interim. Leave aside the Corton Vale thing now. We're moving on and we're going to resolve it. It's the role of the inspectorate and their ability to record their observations and either see that things are done or get an open response from government or from the prison service that say, we're not going to do anything about these things. Because it seems in looking at the history of this period that the matter had been parked. Nobody said we're not doing anything, but equally nobody did anything. moving forward in the future, where do you see the role of HMI? How do we ensure that when he makes recommendations and observations, they're acted on?
I think Brigadier Hugh Munro is doing an excellent job, as did his predecessors, both Andrew McKellen and the late Clive Fairweather, and I pay tribute to them. I think, to be fair, the comments he made regarding Cortonville, some matters were addressed. It was particular items he felt had not been addressed, but he did feel that the 18 months, some matters had failed to be addressed, though he did, I think, acknowledge that other progress had been made in other ways. I think retaining an independent inspectorate is necessary and appropriate. I meet with him on a regular basis, and he has access to me, and these things are ultimately about, you know, working out a solution. I think in the most recent reports he's had out, whether on the open estate or others, there are matters that are challenging for the prison service, but I think equally he also does report, in my view, both good practice and indeed comment quite often on outstanding practice. So I think these things have to be taken in the round. Progress was made about Cortonville. Significant change has now been triggered by Angelini, but I always take with the utmost significance any report from HI Inspector of Prisons.
But would you agree, I mean, that the key point is how do we ensure that when he makes recommendations and observations are acted on? He states very blankly in his subsequent report he witnessed no change as a result of his previous visit 18 months earlier. It's to try, and this is not to seek someone to blame or to criticise, it's to try and ensure that we don't repeat that exercise in the future, either with the women's estate or the men's estate.
Well, these are matters of working with the prison service. My recollection was that progress was made on some issues, but there were fundamental issues that hadn't been made that he challenged. These were matters where Colin McConnell's predecessor felt that there were limitations as to where the prison service could go given the nature of the estates. These matters obviously become governmental responsibilities, and I am held account by both this committee and indeed Parliament. But as I say, I think that's a matter where we need to continue to encourage the dynamic that exists between HMIP and SPS.
I'll leave it at that.
John. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to ask you, make some comment and ask you about recommendations 34 and 5 about structures. Because we've today heard a lot of positive things about the holistic approach and multi-agency working and all the rest, but it certainly seems from what the report found, and what many of us knew already, that out of sight, out of mind, you had people who were incarcerated, weren't being met at the gate there. So can I first of all commend you in including the National Service as part of the consultation, because although I don't want centralisation of services, it seems to me that the fragmentation and the silo mentality that's applied has failed. And whether that's the responsibility of the criminal justice authorities or not, I don't know. There's competing demands there, and I still think we have relatively junior people making simply housing issues on housing criteria rather than with regard to the wider issues. And I, through another body, had experience of that just within the last week. So I think we must be very clear that what we're saying is that people must be supported in terms of housing accommodation, housing and accommodation when they leave prison, rather than give someone a house, because that could be the worst thing that you could do to someone. People need supported when they leave in many instances. But can I ask you, and this is from your letter here, in page 5, where you say we're keen to engage in open dialogue with partners on what should replace the current arrangements. You then go on to talk about the consultation period ending in spring 2013, and go on to say, with announcement and the way forward being made later that year, an introduction of new arrangements in the years 2015-16. And I just wonder if that's quick enough going. I mean, quite often there can be an impetus built up by a report. What happens in that interim period, and is there a danger of slippage?
No, I think you make a fair point, and I accept that. I just think, given the complexity and the number of agencies, and having to balance what I think you correctly point out is how do we get some element of national cohesion but equally local delivery. These things are not complex. So as I was saying to your colleague Sandra White, we believe the status quo is not tenable. That's been made clear by Elise Angelini. We have had initial discussions with COSLA and indeed touched on with ADSW. I think, going out to consultation at the end of the year is probably the earliest that it can be. I think we've got to then allow the consultation because of the complexity, which takes us into spring 2013. I'm open to seeking to truncate or accelerate matters, but given what's already ongoing in terms of health and social care, I think we've got to recognise that there already are significant pressures in that, and we've got to take time to get it right. So I'm happy to give you an undertaking that if we feel it could be accelerated without jeopardising both the democratic input, the complexity of the situation, or indeed the difficulties of wherever it is we choose to go, to bring it forward. Equally, as I say, what I wouldn't want to do is to drive forward without making sure that we bring people with us, to make sure that we get the best possible situation, and to realise that, even when we are undergoing structural change, we have to deal with people with complex needs, and people have to be able to do the day job as well as cope with the change in the whatever it is may be ongoing in their title or for whom they operate. So I can give you that commitment. We feel that's a manageable timescale, but we'll monitor it as it goes along.
Okay, I wonder, can I ask you then, with regard to the 3 stages, where we are at the moment, that interim period after the consultation and thereafter, who is responsible for an individual prisoner? Their overall well-being?
Well, I think it's these are multi-agency, because at the end of the day, some matters, for example, with a prisoner will be health, because they will have a health problem, whether an addiction or mental health. They will also have, entitlement to housing, so that is a statutory matter for the housing local authority. So these things which is why we have to try and bring matters together without, as I say, creating a circumstance where a unseemly bureaucracy is created. So I think these things are about problem solving. It's part to some extent of the whole ethos of where we've got to get to in terms of criminal justice, in terms of how matters are dealt with by the court and solving the problem, in terms of what's the responsibility of the prison service, in terms of solving the problem, in terms of when matters are out. I don't think I see a scenario in which one agency could be given total power to deal or responsibility to deal with some things, because some matters would forever remain within another agency. What we've got to do is to create the structures that bring people together who all have an input, which is housing, health, those who are dealing with mentoring and monitoring and support. So it's how do we bring that structure together? That's why we're going out to consultation. We're open on where it is going, other than saying that the status quo is not tenable. One of the options will be what has been suggested by the Angelini Commission. Equally, I do understand and fully accept why that is not currently favoured by whether even COSLA or indeed EDSW, and there will have to be alternative options.
Would you accept that has the potential to remain fragmented then, with the competing demands between all these various bodies? For instance, should local authorities rewrite their housing allocation policies, or are they robust enough as they are at the moment? When you've got Sandra White made mention of integration of health and social care, well, that's just taking place at the moment. It's not without its challenges again.
Well, I actually think what is working best within the criminal justice service in terms of people coming in is where we get all partners around the table. That's why, whether it's in Glasgow with the community safety partnerships, whether it's replicated in West Lothian and Stirling and other areas, where we've got people around the table, police officers, those who deal with young offenders, those who deal with youth work, those who deal with housing matters, where people look at what has happened. Who caused it? How did it come about? What is the solution? And people are all at the table. So as I say, I tend to think that the future of dealing with these people is to recognise that there's a multitude of people required to be able to deal with these individuals, because we are dealing with individuals. Each individual will be different. Somebody has a drug addiction, somebody has an alcohol problem, somebody has a personality disorder, somebody has a health as well as mental health problem. What we require to have are people there working in partnership, moving away from the silo problem that you've raised, whether that is best solved by creating one single silo or whether it is better by just working at a partnership level. Certainly all the matters that seem to me to be working remarkably well in addressing offending as opposed to dealing with perhaps re-offending and the consequences of offending show that the partnership matter is what is working best. Okay.
I'd like to conclude there if that's... Yes, I'm looking around tentatively, if you can look tentatively. I think that that's been a very thorough session, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for their attendance today. And I'm now going to go back to item 1 on the agenda because we've got an awful lot to do, so I'm not even pausing for breath. And item 1 was to ask you whether you would agree to take items 6, 7 and 8 in private. And Jenny, you objected, and I want to know, first of all, are you objecting to each one of these or can accept some of them, or what?
I mean, as I've raised before, Convener, I object to a lot of the agenda going through in private. I think particularly items 7 and 8, I see no good reason, and I think I've rehearsed the reasons for the work programme being taken in public before.
Can I then take off, we're happy for item 6 to go through in private?
Yes.
Yes? Now, item 7, the work programme. Any comments? Well, can I just say, first of all, my concern is, and you know this from your own paper, which is, of course, a private paper, that quite often we're asking for witnesses, possible witnesses, and I think we have to have discretion when we're doing this, and just about 3 or 4 of the items really require us to consider possible witnesses, and I don't think it's appropriate that we examine or expose or whatever that in public. But then I leave that to committee to reflect. Alison.
Well, I agree with you there on that, Convener, but beyond that, it's also useful to be able to discuss in an informal way issues that we might want to put on the agenda. And it would be unfortunate if people, because we weren't able to put something on the agenda due to time or perhaps other demands, it would be unfortunate if people took away the idea that it wasn't an important issue for us. And I think that's why it's quite useful to be able to discuss these things in private.
John.
Well, I'm instinctively uneasy about private stuff, but I recognise what's been said. I wonder, at some point, probably very early on, a decision was taken either by this individual committee or collectively by committees, or something's informed the precedents. Is there any information that officials could give us on that, perhaps, Convener?
Yes, I mean... I've said this already. You might find it a bit tedious to say it again. In 13 years, 11 of which I've chaired committees, all work programmes have been done in private for the reasons already rehearsed. Nothing mysterious. It's simply that there's a free discussion around issues. People outside don't feel somehow they've not been selected, and it may be for very good reasons of time and so on. We also have to discuss witnesses. There are issues. There is a frank discussion amongst members. I wouldn't want to inhibit frank discussion. I know everybody's got things that they want to put on, and that's absolutely fair, but the committee has to sometimes choose not to do something, and that I feel that we can have a really frank and robust discussion. That's been the position, as I understand, in most committees. I don't know any that do it in public, and it's been like that for the last 12 years. For these reasons, not for any bad reasons. I think they're very sensible reasons, but there we go.
Can I make a suggestion, Convener? I mean, I understand that the discussion of witnesses is sensitive people's names. Could we, I feel on the issue of our priorities quite strongly that we should be able to stand up in public and defend our priorities of what we think the committee should be spending its parliamentary time discussing. Could we split the conversations into 2 and discuss our priorities for the work programme on the record, and then if we decide to take these forward, then discuss witnesses in private?
I think that sounds like a neat solution. It wouldn't work, frankly. I mean, I think it's quite good at the end of a decision on our work programme to perhaps, and a next meeting is to say, say we are going to do these various things for these reasons, which will give people the reasons why we've done it. But I don't see how you can disentangle. And again, I get back to a frank and free discussion amongst members, which is what one wants to have when it's work programmes being discussed. Now, is there anybody else that wants to come back in? Sandra and then Alison again.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's nonsensical to split it in 2. In fact, we've had these conversations before. Spend more more time talking about where we have them in private and we do have the meetings sometime. And I really do object, and I've had it mentioned before, you know, the way that this has been put forward by Jenny Mara, it's as if the Justice Committees want to do things in secret. And it certainly doesn't, because people know exactly what you're coming out for when it comes into public. There's nothing secret about it, nothing underhand. There is sensitive issues to be discussed. It's far better to be discussed in private. And I really do object to every single meeting that we come to here today. Jenny Mara raises the fact that we're not being transparent and we're not somehow we're doing something underhand. Object to that. And I would second the conveners if it is a motion.
Well, it's not a motion, it's a view of experience over the years.
It should be held in private.
And I think I'm going to take Colin, then I'll take Graham, and Alison, you want back in?
Well, we'll see how it develops.
See how it develops, my goodness. Right, Colin.
Yeah, I think I'm with Sandra on this one. I don't normally go on the idea of secrecy, anything like that. But I think considering that there are three issues ahead of us, that it does allow for that frank discussion, that we can at least set up the priority for the substantive debate that will eventually be had.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say it's a pity that Sandra's objecting. I think it's right that we should check ourselves and make sure that what we're doing, the practice that we're involved in, is appropriate, and we question ourselves about why we're doing things in private. And it's right to have this conversation. It reminds us why we're here, and it reminds us of the way we do our work. I think that the approach that Jenny's suggesting is to try and just breathe fresh air through the system and allow the public to understand things. And I don't think there's anything sinister in the desire to share what we do here in private, because folk externally will wonder what we talk about here and think this is where the business is getting done.
Well, now they know. We decide what we're going to do.
It's right, although we're uncomfortable with the exercise of debate, that we should at least talk these things through without feeling that, you know, there's something sinister about it.
No, through the chair. No, I mean, now we have done. I think we've put fairly firmly
Indeed.
why we do it. I mean, there's, you know, there are very good sound reasons for doing it.
Yeah.
And so, can I just move on, unless you want to say, Alison? Right. Those who want item 7, I take it there's still a split of views here. So I would, how many, just take a little vote on this, those who think that item 7 should be held in private. Those against. What's the figures? 6 for and 2 against. And so we're going to hold that in private. Now, number 8, are we going to have a debate about that as well?
I would stand by what I said at the start, convener, that I don't see any good reason why we should be considering a legislative consent memorandum in private. I think that should be on the record. A report on it.
I think, well, I want to get a move on. We've a lot of business to do. And frankly, draft reports, I don't make exceptions to it. The rule has been, for very good reasons, same reasons as before, full and frank discussion, not fighting over a preposition or a comma, which sometimes happens, which is highly embarrassing if we did it in public. I would just move that draft reports, as before, should be in private, and we just get on with it. Do you want a vote on that as well? Do you want a vote on it? No, can I just move on? We're going to do it in private. Okay. Thank you very much. Right. We're now in private. Thank you.